The reason Ibrahim Traore released 1 million chickens into the wild. A shocking and expensive gamble to save Burkina Faso from locust and insect plagues, providing food for both people and wildlife, and a desperate lever for the development of the nation's crop and livestock farming. The world was stunned when President Ibrahim Traoré announced that Burkina Faso would release 1 million chickens into the wild. Even his closest advisors hesitated. Journalists scoffed, calling it an absurd experiment and a wasteful spectacle for a country that could not afford mistakes. Critics whispered that the young captain-turned-president had finally overstepped, that his populist gestures were catching up to him. But standing before a skeptical parliament, Traoré declared with conviction, "This is not chaos. This is strategy." A crisis was facing Burkina Faso. Swarms of desert locusts and outbreaks of crop-eating caterpillars were devastating fields of sorghum, millet, and maize. Overnight, entire harvests vanished. Farmers who had worked for months watched helplessly as their grain turned to dust in a matter of hours. While international aid organizations promised help, their solutions were slow, bureaucratic, and dependent on expensive pesticides imported from Europe. Traoré knew that relying on chemical intervention would only deepen dependency and poison the fragile soil of the Sahel. A solution that was African, natural, and scalable was what he needed. His answer: chickens. Nature's most underestimated army is chickens. They eat locusts, caterpillars, beetles, and worms with an insatiable appetite. Hundreds of insects a day can be consumed by a single chicken. Multiply that by 1 million, and you have a biological weapon against plagues that had terrorized farmers for centuries. But Traoré's plan was more than just pest control. It was also food security. Every chicken is a soldier, he told his people, but also a provider. When the insects dwindled, those same chickens would reproduce, lay eggs, and provide a steady stream of protein for families. By freeing them into fields, forests, and villages, Traoré was turning a pest crisis into a food revolution. The costs were enormous. The national budget was strained by procuring, breeding, and distributing 1 million birds. Logisticians had to coordinate drop points across provinces, ensuring chickens were not concentrated in one area, but spread widely enough to maximize ecological coverage. The effort was mocked by Western commentators as wasting millions on poultry theatrics. But Traoré framed it differently. What is costly is hunger. What is costly is dependence on foreign pesticides. Chickens are an investment, not an expense. On the day of the release, villagers across Burkina Faso gathered in open fields as trucks unloaded crates of clucking birds. Children laughed as chickens scattered into the grasslands. With cautious hope, farmers looked on. The bizarre spectacle was captured by international cameras, a landlocked nation unleashing its feathered army against one of nature's oldest scourges. Behind the showmanship, however, was cold political calculation. Traoré understood optics. He knew that an image of chickens flooding the fields would travel farther than any policy document. It would capture imagination, spark debate, and reinforce his narrative that Burkina Faso would solve African problems with African creativity. It was a defiant gesture to the West, a refusal to bow to imported solutions that came with debt and dependency. For Traoré, the gamble was not about chickens alone. It was about sovereignty. It was about proving that even a poor nation, mocked for its weakness, could innovate boldly and on its own terms. He risked humiliation if the plan failed. If it succeeded, he would be remembered as the man who turned chickens into a weapon of statecraft. And as the first weeks unfolded, the results began to speak for themselves. Locust swarms that had previously blackened the skies now broke apart as chickens devoured their advancing fronts. Reduced damage in fields where the birds roamed freely was reported by farmers. Meanwhile, a surge of eggs selling at lower prices than in years past was seen in local markets. Protein intake improved, especially among children, and the countryside buzzed with a new kind of optimism. The world had doubted Traoré, but within weeks of the release of 1 million chickens, even his harshest critics began to ask, what if this gamble works? The release of 1 million chickens was never just about pest control, and Ibrahim Traoré knew it. He understood that in politics, perception is often as important as policy. A living metaphor for his leadership became the chickens. Unconventional, grassroots, and defiantly independent of Western models. Every feathered bird scratching in the soil was a reminder that Burkina Faso was rewriting the rules of governance and survival. What began as an ecological experiment quickly transformed into a political spectacle. Farmers who once complained of being forgotten by distant leaders suddenly felt seen. They spoke of the president not as an aloof figure in the capital, but as someone willing to gamble for their survival. No one has ever fought locusts with chickens, village elders told local radio stations. But if it is our chickens, it is our solution. This language of ownership was precisely what Traoré wanted. He had reframed the fight against hunger not as charity delivered from outside, but as a national mission led from within. The rural economy was also re-energized in unexpected ways. Poultry markets boomed as farmers began trading birds more actively. Families who had received chickens started breeding them, creating a cycle of production that generated new income streams. Instead of buying expensive pesticides, villages invested in feed, co-ops, and simple veterinary care, all of which stimulated local commerce. More abundant and affordable became eggs, reducing malnutrition among children and providing women with a steady product to sell in roadside stalls. Far beyond Burkina Faso's borders reached the symbolism. Regional neighbors battling their own locust outbreaks took notice. Delegations from Niger and Mali quietly sent observers to study how the program was working. What they found was remarkable. Pest damage in test zones had fallen by as much as 40% compared to control areas, and this without a single liter of imported pesticide. In the Sahel, where ecological challenges often demand cross-border cooperation, Traoré's chicken strategy was beginning to look like a regional export in its own right. But the brilliance of the plan lay in how Traoré manipulated the narrative. Western media outlets initially mocked the initiative with headlines like "Burkina Faso goes to the birds" or "Chickens against locusts, Africa's new folly." Yet instead of responding defensively, he leaned into the ridicule. He gave interviews in which he smiled and said, "Yes, chickens are foolish, but sometimes the foolish win." This disarming rhetoric turned mockery into curiosity and curiosity into respect. Before long, think tanks in Europe were publishing reports about avian biocontrol strategies, and universities were dispatching students to research the outcomes. What had begun as a joke was now a subject of serious academic discussion. Domestically, Traoré turned the chicken release into a tool of political consolidation. He made sure that distribution was carried out by local councils rather than centralized ministries, giving communities a sense of agency and reducing accusations of favoritism. He also mandated that 30% of the chickens go to women-led households, both to empower rural women and to showcase his administration's commitment to gender equity. These decisions bought him political capital and demographics often marginalized by previous governments. The opposition, sensing the popularity of the program, struggled to find effective lines of attack. They tried to argue that the costs were unsustainable, that releasing chickens was a distraction from serious governance. But each time they raised these points, they were drowned out by testimonies from farmers whose fields had been saved or mothers whose children now had eggs to eat daily. The chickens, in short, became politically untouchable. Internationally, the optics worked in Traoré's favor as well. By championing a homegrown solution, he positioned himself as part of a larger African renaissance, rejecting neo-colonial dependency. At conferences, he framed the chicken initiative as a metaphor for multipolarity. The West brings chemicals, China brings machinery, but Africa brings life. We will not choose dependency. We will choose creativity. This line resonated across the continent, especially among younger Africans eager to see their leaders break free from the binary trap of East versus West. Thus, the chickens became not just biological allies, but diplomatic messengers. Yet, beneath the symbolism, there was hard strategy. Traoré used the momentum of the chicken program to push through wider agricultural reforms. He announced subsidies for poultry feed made from local grains, creating a feedback loop where crop farmers supplied poultry farmers, and poultry farmers in turn helped protect crops from pests. He expanded veterinary training programs to rural areas, professionalizing the care of animals and reducing losses to disease. He also leveraged Chinese and Brazilian expertise to design hybrid models of integrated pest management where chickens played a central role alongside modern technologies. This blending of traditional ecological knowledge with modern science was politically genius. It allowed Traore to present himself as modern and progressive without appearing to abandon African roots. Economically, the returns were beginning to justify the gamble. Studies by the Ministry of Agriculture estimated that reduced crop losses had saved nearly $70 million worth of grain in the first year alone, more than offsetting the initial costs of breeding and distributing the birds. The surplus grain not only stabilized domestic food prices, but also allowed Burkina Faso to increase exports to neighboring countries, improving its balance of trade. Suddenly, what had been mocked as a wasteful stunt was proving to be an economically rational policy. Traore also used the chicken story to reposition Burkina Faso on the international stage. At the African Union Summit, he gave a speech in which he declared, "A nation that can defend itself against locusts with chickens can defend itself against poverty with courage." Delegates erupted in applause, not because they all believed in chickens, but because they recognized the deeper point. Sovereignty comes from innovation, not imitation. By turning poultry into a weapon of political theater and statecraft, Traore had done something few leaders manage. He had created a story powerful enough to redefine how his nation was perceived both internally and globally. Chickens were no longer just animals. They were symbols of defiance, resilience, and independence. And as the locusts retreated and the eggs multiplied, even his fiercest critics had to admit that Ibrahim Traore had outmaneuvered them once again, turning ridicule into reverence and risk into opportunity. As the months passed, Ibrahim Traore's gamble with 1 million chickens began to outgrow the borders of Burkina Faso. What had initially seemed like an eccentric domestic initiative started attracting attention from African leaders who faced similar crises of pests, food insecurity, and ecological fragility. Delegations from Mali, Niger, Chad, and even Kenya came to Ouagadougou to see the outcomes for themselves. They walked through the fields with local farmers, spoke with villagers, and tallied eggs in bustling markets. The results spoke more powerfully than any diplomatic communiqué. In zones where the chickens roamed, pest infestations had plummeted, food prices had stabilized, and rural incomes were slowly climbing. Traore recognized that this was the ideal moment to expand his vision into a continental story. At the following African Union Agriculture Summit, he presented Burkina Faso's experiment not just as an odd national policy, but as a model of African ingenuity. He spoke with fiery passion, proclaiming, "For too long, we have imported pesticides from Europe and America at costs we cannot afford. For too long, we have poisoned our soils and trapped ourselves in cycles of dependency. But Africa has its own solutions. Our chickens eat locusts better than chemicals ever could, and they feed our children while they defend our crops. This is sovereignty with wings." The hall broke into applause. And just like that, the image of chickens as soldiers of food security spread across the continent. Traore knew how to weaponize narrative as effectively as policy. International media that once mocked him now began referring to him as the poultry president or the captain of chickens, titles he wore proudly, understanding their influence. Every headline, whether written in jest or admiration, strengthened his image as a bold innovator, unafraid to challenge convention. Yet the deeper cunning was in how he connected the chicken program to wider alliances. He started negotiations with BRICS partners to finance large-scale poultry feed production plants across Burkina Faso. China agreed to help build processing facilities to turn surplus chickens into exportable meat products, while Brazil offered expertise in poultry genetics to boost productivity. India contributed veterinary vaccines to maintain the health of the growing poultry population. By aligning his feathered army with global South cooperation, Traore turned an ecological gamble into a pillar of South-South trade. Western nations, sensing the symbolic threat, tried to dismiss the program as unsustainable. Reports from European think tanks warned that releasing chickens into the wild would cause disease outbreaks or ecological imbalance. But Traore countered by inviting scientists from African universities to conduct transparent studies. These studies showed that chickens, when managed properly, posed little ecological risk and actually enhanced biodiversity by naturally controlling insect populations. He then presented these findings at international forums, embarrassing his critics and positioning Burkina Faso as a producer of knowledge rather than a passive subject of Western expertise.